Welcome to your deep dive. Today, we're going down a rabbit hole that you've presented us with. The intersection of Christian nationalism and sexual immorality in the United States.
Yeah.
You've sent over
A big one.
some seriously thought-provoking articles and research.
It's a topic that's definitely gaining traction in our current political and social landscape. And honestly, it's a little unsettling to see how this ideology is beginning to shape policy decisions.
It is unsettling. So to kick things off, can you give us a brief overview of Christian nationalism for anyone who might not be totally familiar with the concept?
Of course. At its core, Christian nationalism is the belief that the United States is fundamentally a Christian nation, and that its laws and governance should be based on a very specific interpretation of biblical principles, often drawn from the Old Testament.
Okay, so they're not just talking about love thy neighbor. They're getting into the nitty-gritty of Old Testament law.
Yeah.
What's an example of how this plays out when it comes to sexual morality?
Well, one of the most commonly cited passages is Leviticus 18:24-29. This section of the Bible discusses how God punished entire nations for what they deem sexual immorality, even going as far as to say that the land itself vomited out its inhabitants.
Wow, that's some pretty intense imagery. Why do you think this particular passage resonates so strongly with this movement?
It's interesting, isn't it? I think it has to do with the idea of collective punishment. It fuels this belief that even individual actions can bring divine judgment upon the entire nation.
Right.
It's a potent motivator for those who subscribe to this ideology.
So it creates a sense of urgency and maybe even a bit of fear-mongering. If we don't crack down on this sin, we're all going to be punished.
Exactly. It creates a framework where control becomes paramount. And one of the ways they exert that control is by defining what exactly constitutes sexual immorality,
Right.
which is where things start to get really interesting and concerning.
Okay, let's unpack that. What kinds of behaviors fall under their definition of sexual immorality?
Well, it's a lot more expansive than what many people might assume. We're not just talking about things like adultery.
Right.
They often include premarital sex,
Yeah.
any sexual activity outside of heterosexual marriage,
Okay.
even kissing, masturbation, homosexuality, transgender identity.
Wow.
Basically, any form of sexual expression that falls outside of their very narrow interpretation of biblical principles.
Wow, that's a pretty wide net they're casting. Andra Watkins, in her Substack, even mentions that some Christian nationalists believe that two teens sharing their first kiss constitutes sexual immorality.
Yeah, and it really highlights the extent to which they seek to control the narrative around sex.
Right.
It's not just about individual behavior. It's about dictating acceptable norms and limiting any form of expression that challenges their worldview.
Now that we've established this really rigid definition of sexual immorality, I'm curious about how this movement views women. I'm noticing a pattern in these sources, and it's a bit troubling.
It's a crucial aspect to understand.
Yeah.
They seem to place women in a very contradictory position. On one hand, they're seen as the guardians of purity and morality, responsible for upholding these strict sexual standards.
Almost like they're expected to be the gatekeepers of sexual behavior for everyone.
Exactly. But on the other hand, women are also portrayed as inherently tempting, susceptible to sin,
Right.
almost like they're the embodiment of Eve's original sin in the Garden of Eden.
So it's this impossible double bind. Women are both responsible for preventing sin and blamed when it occurs. It seems like a pretty exhausting and unfair role to be cast in.
It is, and it's fascinating how this tension plays out in modern movements and ideologies.
Okay.
One example that Watkins highlights is the rise of the trad wife movement.
Hold on. For those of us not up on the latest lingo, could you break down what a trad wife is?
Sure, trad wives advocate for a return to what they see as traditional gender roles, with women primarily focused on homemaking, child-rearing, and submitting to their husbands.
And how does this tie back into Christian nationalism and its views on sexuality?
Well, it really exemplifies this idea of controlling women's agency. It's about limiting their choices, dictating their roles,
Yeah.
and framing it as a way to preserve traditional values and family structures.
It also seems like this ideology is a driving force behind the opposition to abortion rights, contraception, and comprehensive sex education.
Absolutely. It's all connected to this idea of controlling women's bodies and choices.
Right.
And what's even more concerning is that this control is often justified under the guise of protecting the unborn or upholding God's will.
This is starting to paint a pretty disturbing picture, especially when we consider the implications for personal privacy.
That's a crucial point.
Yeah.
This ideology isn't just about shaping individual behavior. It has real-world consequences for policy and legislation.
And one of the most alarming examples of this is Justice Clarence Thomas's concurring opinion in the Dobbs decision, which overturned Roe v. Wade.
Right.
Can you remind our listener about that?
Of course. Justice Thomas argued that the logic used to overturn Roe v. Wade could also be applied to other landmark rulings that rely on the right to privacy.
Okay.
Like Griswold v. Connecticut, which guaranteed the right to contraception, and Obergefell v. Hodges, which legalized same-sex marriage.
So essentially, he's opening the door for potential challenges to all sorts of fundamental rights that we often take for granted.
That's the danger.
Yeah.
And it's not just theoretical. We're already seeing efforts to monitor and control behavior, often using technology and surveillance.
Right.
Which is where things start to get really Orwellian.
Hold that thought.
Right.
We're going to pick up right here in part 2 of this deep dive, where we explore the specifics of those tactics and their implications.
Welcome back to our deep dive into the world of Christian nationalism and its growing influence on sexual morality in the U.S.
Before the break, we were talking about how this ideology is moving beyond just rhetoric and starting to manifest in some pretty unsettling ways.
Yeah, it's not just about shaping individual morality anymore. It's about using the power of the state to enforce a very specific worldview.
And we were just about to get into the specifics of how they're actually doing that.
Right.
You mentioned surveillance and technology.
Yes, and one of the examples that Andra Watkins highlights in her work is something called Project 2025.
Okay.
It's a plan that seeks to essentially turn the CDC into a nationwide tracking unit for abortion and transgender care.
Wait, so they're talking about creating a system to monitor people's reproductive choices and gender identity?
Yes.
That sounds incredibly invasive.
It is.
Wow.
Imagine a world where doctors are required to report every pregnancy outcome, every instance of gender-affirming care. It would create a chilling effect on both patients and providers.
It's like something out of a dystopian novel where Big Brother is constantly watching and judging your most personal decisions.
And it's not just hypothetical.
Right.
We're already seeing similar tactics being deployed in states like Texas with the infamous SB 8 law, the so-called abortion bounty hunter law.
Right, that law empowers private citizens to sue anyone involved in an abortion.
Yes.
Even the person driving a woman to a clinic.
Exactly.
It's terrifying.
It creates a climate of fear and suspicion where people are afraid to even talk about abortion, let alone seek one.
Right.
And it sets a dangerous precedent for using the legal system to target and harass people based on their personal beliefs.
It seems like they're not just trying to restrict access to certain procedures or information, but to create an environment where these topics are completely taboo.
Exactly. It's about controlling the narrative, silencing dissent, and ultimately shaping the culture according to their very narrow worldview.
And Watkins paints some even more disturbing hypothetical scenarios in her work.
Yes, she talks about the possibility of a fornication finder app where people could anonymously report their neighbors for suspected instances of sexual immorality.
That's terrifying. It's like a digital witch hunt.
And while it might seem far-fetched,
Yeah.
it's not entirely outside the realm of possibility given the trends we're seeing. The technology exists, and the motivation is clearly there.
It's a stark reminder of how quickly things can unravel when you start down this path of eroding privacy and empowering the state to police people's personal lives.
Absolutely, and it's crucial to recognize that these efforts are often framed in terms of protecting children or upholding traditional values.
Right.
But the underlying goal is control.
It's about power. It's about who gets to define what is acceptable and who gets punished for stepping outside those boundaries.
And it's important to remember that this ideology doesn't just impact people who engage in the behaviors they deem immoral.
You mean everyone is at risk even if they personally adhere to the prescribed moral code?
Exactly, because once you start down this path of eroding privacy, of empowering the government to intrude into people's personal lives, it's very difficult to contain.
So even if you agree with their stance on, say, premarital sex, you could still be targeted for something else they deem immoral.
Absolutely. Maybe you have a transgender child, or you access birth control, or you simply express an opinion that challenges their worldview.
It creates a chilling effect on society as a whole.
Yes.
People become afraid to speak out, to be different, to even think for themselves.
And that's ultimately the goal, to create a society where conformity is valued above all else.
It's a bleak picture, but I think it's crucial to understand the stakes here.
I agree. We can't afford to be complacent.
Right.
We need to be aware of these trends, and we need to actively resist them.
So what can we do? Where do we go from here?
Well, I think the first step is education.
Okay.
We need to talk about these issues, to raise awareness, to help people understand the dangers of this ideology.
So having conversations like this one is a good start.
Absolutely, knowledge is power.
Right.
The more we understand about how this movement operates, the better equipped we are to challenge it.
And what about concrete actions? What can people do in their own lives to push back against this?
There are many things we can support: organizations that are fighting for reproductive rights, for LGBTQ plus equality, for the separation of church and state.
Groups like the ACLU, Planned Parenthood, Lambda Legal, and Americans United for Separation of Church and State come to mind.
Exactly. We can donate to these organizations. We can volunteer our time. We can contact our elected officials and demand that they protect our freedoms.
And what about on a personal level? How can we combat this ideology in our daily interactions?
I think it's important to have open and honest conversations with people who hold different beliefs.
That's not always easy, especially in our current climate of polarization.
True, but it's essential.
Yeah.
We need to find ways to bridge the divides and build common ground.
And I think part of that involves focusing on shared values.
Absolutely. While we may disagree on specific interpretations of religious texts or the role of government, I think most Americans can agree on the importance of freedom, fairness, and opportunity for all.
Those are core American values that transcend any particular ideology or belief system.
Exactly. And I think by appealing to these shared values, we can start to build a more inclusive and just society.
It's about finding common ground, even in the midst of disagreement.
Right. And it's about recognizing that our strength as a nation lies in our diversity, not in our conformity.
Beautifully said. Watkins also dives into some of the psychological underpinnings of this movement, particularly among women.
Yes, and this is a crucial aspect to understand.
Okay.
She highlights the role of envy and regret in driving some of the more extreme viewpoints within this movement.
Can you elaborate on that a bit?
Sure. Watkins suggests that some women who feel they've made personal sacrifices in adherence to this ideology, perhaps by foregoing educational or career opportunities or staying in unhappy marriages,
Right.
may experience envy towards women who made different choices.
So it's like a sense of, if I had to sacrifice, so should everyone else.
That's one way to interpret it.
Yeah.
And coupled with this envy is a sense of regret for the paths not taken.
Okay.
This combination, Watkins argues, can lead to a desire to control and limit the choices of other women.
It's a fascinating psychological insight.
Yeah.
And it helps explain why there's such a strong push to restrict access to abortion and contraception among some groups. Exactly.
It's about controlling women's bodies and reproductive choices, often under the guise of protecting the unborn or upholding traditional values.
And this plays into the larger narrative of women as both temptresses and guardians of morality.
It does.
It's a complex and frankly exhausting role to be cast in.
Absolutely. And it's important to recognize that this narrative is not only harmful to women, but also limits the potential for genuine human connection and understanding between genders.
It perpetuates a cycle of blame and control rather than fostering healthy relationships based on respect and equality.
Exactly. And it's a reminder that challenging these deeply ingrained beliefs requires not just policy changes, but also a shift in our cultural understanding of gender roles and sexuality.
So where do we go from here? How do we combat this ideology and protect our freedoms in the face of these efforts to control and restrict?
That's the million-dollar question, isn't it?
Yeah.
And it's not a simple answer.
Right.
It requires a multifaceted approach that addresses both the legal and cultural dimensions of this issue.
We need to be strategic and persistent in our efforts.
Absolutely. On the legal front, that means supporting organizations that are fighting for reproductive rights, for LGBTQ plus equality, and for the separation of church and state.
Organizations like the ACLU, Planned Parenthood, and Lambda Legal are doing crucial work in this area.
Exactly. And we can support them through donations, volunteering, and advocating for policies that protect our freedoms.
And on the cultural front, it's about having open and honest conversations about these issues.
Right. We need to challenge the harmful narratives that are used to justify these restrictions and promote a more inclusive and understanding view of sexuality and gender.
It's about education awareness and empathy.
Precisely. And it's about creating a culture where everyone feels safe and respected regardless of their beliefs or choices.
It's a tall order, but it's essential work if we want to create a more just and equitable society.
Absolutely. And it's a reminder that we all have a role to play in this fight. Whether it's speaking out against discrimination, supporting organizations that are working for change, or simply having open and honest conversations with our friends and family, Every action counts.
It's about recognizing that our freedoms are interconnected.
They are.
When one group's rights are under attack, we're all at risk.
Exactly. And it's about understanding that this is not a battle that can be won overnight.
Right.
It requires sustained effort, collaboration, and a willingness to challenge the status quo.
It's a marathon, not a sprint.
Well said. And it's a marathon that we need to run together if we want to reach the finish line.
So, as we wrap up this part of our deep dive, I want to leave you with a question to ponder. What role can you play in pushing back against this ideology and creating a more just and equitable world?
It's a question worth reflecting on because ultimately the future of our freedoms depends on the actions we take today.
Welcome back to the final part of our deep dive into this complex world of Christian nationalism and sexual morality. You know, something that's been on my mind throughout this whole conversation is the role of fear. You know, how this movement really seems to thrive on it.
It's a clever tactic. By framing their agenda in terms of protecting children, and upholding traditional values,
Right.
they appeal to a deep-seated desire for order and security.
Yeah.
It's very effective.
Right, and it allows them to present themselves as like the guardians of righteousness.
Exactly.
Which makes it so easy to just dismiss anyone who disagrees as being, immoral or attacking faith.
Exactly. It creates a dynamic where they can dismiss any criticism as an attack on faith or morality.
Right.
Rather than engaging in a substantive debate about the actual implications of their policies.
And it seems like they're particularly adept at, at leveraging fear to advance their agenda.
Absolutely. Fear is a powerful motivator.
Yeah.
Watkins, she argues that they tap into a deep-seated anxiety about societal change, about the erosion of traditional values, about the perceived threat of those who are different.
Yeah, she even uses the term moral panic to describe how they amplify these fears and create a sense of urgency around issues like LGBTQ plus rights and sexual freedom.
It's a way of rallying their base and justifying increasingly intrusive policies.
Right.
When people are afraid.
Mm-hmm.
They're more likely to accept restrictions on their freedoms in the name of security or protection.
And it's not just about controlling individual behavior, right? They're also trying to reshape the legal landscape to reflect their worldview.
That's right. Their goal is to codify their specific interpretation of morality into law.
Right.
We see this in their efforts to restrict access to abortion, ban comprehensive sex education, and even challenge the legal basis for same-sex marriage.
Yeah, it's like they're trying to turn back the clock on social progress and create a society that conforms to their very, very narrow definition of what's acceptable.
And it's important to understand that this isn't just about imposing their beliefs on others.
Okay.
It's also about consolidating power.
Power? In what way?
By controlling the narrative around morality. By dictating what's acceptable and what's not, they gain a tremendous amount of influence over people's lives.
It's like they're saying, we have the moral authority, therefore we should have the political authority.
Exactly, and that's a dangerous path.
Yeah.
It undermines the very foundations of a pluralistic democracy, where different beliefs and values are supposed to coexist.
So how do we push back against this? How do we protect our freedoms and ensure that our society remains inclusive and diverse?
I think it starts with understanding the tactics they're using.
Okay.
And the motivations behind them.
Right.
We need to be able to recognize and call out fear-mongering, dog whistle politics, and attempts to erode the separation of church and state.
We also need to be proactive in supporting organizations that are fighting for civil rights,
Yes.
reproductive justice, and LGBTQ plus equality.
Absolutely. Groups like the ACLU, Planned Parenthood, Lambda Legal.
Right.
These organizations are on the front lines of defending our freedoms and challenging discriminatory laws.
And it's not just about legal battles, though, is it? It's also about changing hearts and minds.
That's a crucial point.
Yeah.
We need to have open and honest conversations with people who hold different beliefs.
Right.
We need to find ways to connect on a human level and build empathy and understanding.
I know it's not always easy, especially in our current climate of polarization,
It's not.
but it's essential if we want to create a society where everyone feels valued and respected.
I agree. It's about recognizing that we all share a common humanity,
Mm-hmm.
regardless of our differences.
Right.
And it's about working together to build a world where everyone has the freedom to live their lives authentically and with dignity.
That's a powerful message. As we wrap up this deep dive, I want to thank you for sharing your insights and expertise.
It's been my pleasure.
These are really complex and challenging issues, but I am hopeful that by understanding them better, we can work together to create a more just and equitable future. And to our listener, thank you for joining us on this journey. We hope this deep dive has given you a new perspective on the intersection of Christian nationalism and sexual morality and empowered you to engage in these important conversations. Remember, your voice matters, your actions matter, and together we can make a difference.